Here at the Alan Turing Institute, our mission is to make great leaps in data science and artificial intelligence research in order to change the world for the better.
This podcast explores the research, ideas and technologies behind a data revolution with the people responsible for shaping our future.
Welcome to the Turing Podcast. Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Turing Podcast. Today we're speaking to Robert Foley, who is a Professor of Human Evolution at the University of Cambridge, as well as being a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. Today we'll be discussing his work with the Turing in Palaeoanalytics, which involves applying data science and machine learning methods to human evolutionary studies. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Before we jump into your research with the Alan Turing Institute, can you tell us a bit about your background? How did you come to be where you are now, and how has the field of human evolution changed during your career?
Oh, massively, because it's been a long career. So I actually started life in archaeology. I read archaeology and anthropology at Cambridge, but became more and more interested in ecology and devolution. So very early in my career, I moved more into the biological sciences, and I was a lecturer in Durham, and then I moved back to Cambridge, where I've been now for 35 years. And my particular interests have always really been, I suppose, in two things. One is trying to really ask the question, how and why did humans evolve, and applying general evolutionary principles. I think there's often been a view that humans are special, so they must have evolved through special means and special mechanisms. And what I've always been interested in just trying to do is find general evolutionary models and apply those. And that led me particularly to think strongly about ecology. And then the second aspect is partly because I think my background was more in archaeology than in anatomy, which is where most of my colleagues tend to come from, is I'm very interested in behavior. How did human evolution behavior evolve? Because, while the lumps and bumps on skulls are very interesting, they're not really what makes us human. I mean, what makes us human is how we think and how we act and behave. So I've tried to work on that. And that's led me in many directions. I've done a lot of fieldwork in East Africa. I've done fieldwork in other areas, such as the Solomon Islands. But it's also led me, I suppose, really away from classic paleontology into a whole range of subjects, because I got quite interested in biology, evolutionary ecology, and behavioral science and cognitive science. So it's and I suppose what that boils down to is that in the course of my career, human evolution studies has just become multidisciplinary. So what started off as the domain of professors of anatomy has now become full of cognitive scientists and archaeologists and bioinformatics, and particularly genetics.
Right. I have a little bit of a side question, which is based on that, which is what does a typical field trip in your area to the Solomon Islands actually include? Because I remember, back when I was in my undergraduate days, I chose to study biology on the basis of the particular university I went to had a marine biology field trip to Indonesia, where we got to go in the coral reefs and do scuba diving and stuff, and that was science in quotation marks. But I'm guessing, if you're not looking at coral, if you're looking at human stuff. So what would you get up to on a trip?
So the work in the Solomon Islands, which was done quite a long time ago with Martin Mirazon-La, and it was different from the work we mostly do in Africa, in that we were really interested in looking at the living population, the living people, and the question there was this one. we were just beginning to explore and get an idea about human genetic diversity. This was in the early 2000s, and people came out of Africa and so on. But what there had been very little work on is how genetic diversity related to what you could think of as the natural boundaries of human society. So you could say, if you've got a particular pattern of genetic diversity, how does it relate to linguistic diversity? So what we were very interested in doing there is to go and say, well, okay, let's look at the genes and see how they are spread, and then look at the languages and the language boundaries and see whether the genes and the genetic boundaries and the language boundaries coincided. And since then, a lot of work has been done in this area by others than ourselves. And the answer, of course, is sometimes yes and sometimes no. But that becomes a really interesting thing, and it comes back to the behavior. You might say, I think there's often a sense that human evolutionary biology, we think that it's all about the genes determining things. And of course, in this case, it's the other way around, that languages often determine who you mate with, who your partners are. So the genes follow the cultures. So it's the inverse of what a lot of people often thought about social Darwinism and so on. And that's what we were really interested in. It was quite a difficult area to work, because you've got these little islands and you bounce on these in my view terribly dangerous little boats, going from island to island. But it's an extraordinary experience. I mean, you live in entirely different conditions from those you might expect anywhere else, and you meet, in our case, people who are extraordinarily hospitable with their time and the information they gave us. So that was really quite an experience.
I think that's quite a good point, to think about how, sorry, I really like this tangent, but we're thinking about how language actually influences, and we don't need to go to a remote island to see that. Even just in Europe, it happens with all the languages that we have. So I suppose it's a logical, which could be quite easy to see. Yeah. But then it was like, yeah, it makes sense.
It's a really interesting point that, like, the language barrier itself could act as a thing that separates populations from a reproductive point of view. Think I'm remembering from my own biology degree and stuff, the way you would think about how animal populations speciate, so going from one species into multiple over time, is there would be some kind of barrier, normally a geographical barrier, that would separate one population from another, and they would become isolated, and over many generations they would, become reproductively isolated. But it's interesting to think that language differences could have the same effects in humans.
Yeah, I think they can, and not just language. I mean, it can be the way you dress. It could be things that you can take on and off, and of course, I mean, what is the case with all living humans, and probably humans going back, for tens of thousands of years, is that there's no evidence of anything like speciation. So what that really means is that these things act to damp down gene flow, but they don't act as a real barrier, because you always have people, going across language barriers and reproducing. I mean, it could be the rebellious girl or the rebellious boy deciding that they're going to, marry somebody that they've fallen desperately in love with in a different language group. Or it could be something more systematic than that. It could be that there is actually exchange of partners. And then there's the other side of it, which we see historically in the other area, the area I work mostly, which is East Africa, where you get a lot of raiding among groups, and they raid, and one of the things they will take are women. So the women are going back, and they're having their reproductive lifespan in a different group. So the idea that human genetic variation is neatly partitioned in this way is not right. So the result is that we can look back in deep time and we see relationships between genes and languages. But when you look at the micro mechanisms, it's a much, much more subtle pattern than that. I think human diversity is an incredibly complicated field. But it's that interplay that makes it so interesting and so impossible to pin down in some of the very sort of loose categories that we see a lot in the press, for example.
Right, yeah. And I was wondering as well, because you mentioned earlier that obviously the thing that's changed the field dramatically over the last decade or couple of decades has been genetics. So what has been, the big impact of our understanding of human evolution since genetics and genomics has, been the primary way in which you would now research it?
It's massive. And of course, in a way, a great disappointment to me, because I never really paid attention to genetics lectures when I was an undergraduate. So the impact
haven't we all?
It wasn't very interesting then. It was all, fruit flies and so on. But now it's fascinating. So it's been massive. And
actually, fruit flies is your specialisation, isn't it, B?
Yeah, my PhD was with fruit flies. Yeah.
Well, actually, fruit flies are tremendously exciting and interesting.
It's okay, because if I remember correctly, you spent a lot of time actually killing the fruit flies.
Yes, and I'm not working with them anymore, so we can stays between us.
Well, so the fruit flies are probably very pleased about that then. So yes, it had an impact, and I'll sort of split it up into two bits. I mean, one is just when people started being able to do, genetic sequencing and be able to identify within species variation relatively easily, and the big impact of that was, of course, what we now think of as the out of Africa model of modern human evolution. So paleontologists had already begun thinking that it was likely that modern humans evolved in Africa, but it was a rather vague notion. And then along came Alan Wilson and his students, and showed diversity in the mitochondrial genome, showing very clearly that most of the diversity is African. So Eurasian genetic diversity, and this is true mitochondrially and elsewhere, is a subset of African variation, and that's there's so many things that come out of that knowledge. It comes that humans have a much deeper history in Africa than elsewhere, that African diversity is extraordinary. So you can have two villages in West Africa that are more distant from each other genetically than you and I are from Chinese. So this changes the way we think about things. But the other perhaps more important thing is how little variation there is. Humans are not a genetically diverse species, which is a surprise because phenotypically we think we are. And what that means is that there's been very little time for genetic diversity to accumulate. And that, going back to what we were talking about earlier, is one of the reasons why there's no hard and fast racial groups or long, deep lineages. There are deep patterns, but gene flow has been an important part of it. And we're actually peas in a pod, genetically speaking.
Right. Yeah, I guess that comes back to there's no reproductively isolated human groups. We're all very much part of the same species.
Yeah, we are. I mean, there's, don't get me wrong, there's clearly variation, and it's geographically significant. And we know the history that, we all go back to an ancestral population in Africa, 200,000 or 300,000 years ago, perhaps a bit more. And we were in Africa then until about 70,000 years ago, mostly. And then you get the big dispersals into Eurasia. So all that diversity we see in Eurasia is very, very young. And of course, it's people, we read stories as children about the great sweeping of groups across the Eurasian steppes and so on. And that's what's shaped us, is this history of patterns of dispersal and a kind of ebb and flow of isolation. People get different, and then the isolation goes, population disperses, admixture takes place, extinction occurs, all these things are happening. So I think, I said there are two elements in that. Just that discovery, which is really the out of Africa story, we'd never ever have got without genetics. And then the second element is the ancient DNA. So when people started getting being able to get DNA directly out of fossils, this was a real game changer. It took a long time to happen. The first results were sketchy, highly subject to contamination and so on, but eventually, and now it works, and that's really showed us a whole new insight. Firstly, it's given us much more depth into that pattern of diversity that I talked about, so we can see in much more clearly. But the other thing is it has, as far as we can tell, not everybody accepts this, that, for example, humans, as they came out of Africa 60,000 years or so ago, interbred with Neanderthals, which we think of as a separate species. And Neanderthals and our ancestors have probably been separate for more than 500,000 years. So you can imagine the surprise of a Neanderthal sitting in Eurasia, and suddenly in come these, tall, thin African populations, and they interbred. Not very much, probably, but enough to leave a trace behind. And of course, that again makes you ask all sorts of questions about, well, what sort of behaviours were involved? They can't have spoken the same language. Was this, a mutually satisfactory experience, or something more rapacious? Genes seem to go from Neanderthals into modern humans. We don't find many genes going from modern humans into Neanderthals. It's a bit of a one-way traffic.
Are those the ancient DNA samples that we have in Neanderthals? I mean, how many of them do we have, or is there enough to be able to know that?
There's quite a lot now. I mean, you're right. I mean, I will mention a number, and of course, in the Alan Turing Institute, where data science and any number less than several billion is small. We're talking probably now 50 or so Neanderthal samples that of more or less quality. So we're learning that, and then the other insights that come is we can look at the genetic structures, and we can say something about whether they were very inbred. For example, Siberian Neanderthals appear to have been very inbred, their own diversity, and begin to start thinking about functional adaptations. What are the genes? And you see a lot of things saying that it's the Neanderthal genes that give us immunity against this disease or reduce that. And that's emerging. I think I'm a little bit skeptical about how much of that I think we understand, given we don't understand a great deal about a lot of functional genes in living people. But that genetics has really transformed the way we do it, and it changes at a rate which I think also has revolutionized the way the rest of us have to think about things.
Yeah, it certainly has big impacts on the way we think about human culture and global politics and history and so on, to understand a lot of what was going on in prehistoric times through human migration that I guess otherwise would have been lost to history, especially if it was occurring before recorded history.
You're absolutely right, and you asked me at the very beginning how things have changed. Well, if you told me when I was an undergraduate that we would be calculating the group sizes of an extinct species of hominid, I would have said no way, let alone being able to tell its skin color from the basis of genes. So it really has had a massive effect and on what we know, and also the way we think about human evolution.
I have a side question, because I'm sorry, this is a very side question, but regarding evolution, how do you find the perspectives that people have for evolution for non-human evolution? So, like, for example, that there is nothing particularly special about us, but maybe we developed language before we humans developed language before other species, and that's the special element. Or do you think it is a more special journey?
So, in a way, that is I think you're being modest in calling it a side question, because it's probably, it's the rupture that runs through so much of the whole of humanity's idea about what it means to be human. And on the one side, you'll have those who think that, we look at chimpanzees, for example, and they're just one step away from writing the works of Shakespeare, and the continuity is very there. And on the others who see, say, for example, language as this great chasm that divides humans from the rest of the animal world. I'll say a couple of things. I mean, one is I think I like to distinguish between whether we are very unique from the question of how we got that uniqueness. So, you talk to primatologists, people who study chimpanzees, and they tend to see a very narrow gap between humans and apes. And then other people who say, no, there's a very wide gap. I think I tend towards it's a pretty wide gap, and I'll come back to that in a second. But I don't think there's anything special about the way that gap happened. In other words, it's ordinary mechanisms of natural selection that are changing this whole process. Donkeys years ago, I wrote a book called Another Unique Species, in which the point of it was that humans are unique, but all species are unique. And what's interesting is how that uniqueness, that adaptive uniqueness, evolves. So I think to my mind, the challenge, or the way I would do it, is say, let's just assume everything happens just as it would have done for your Drosophila until it's proved differently. And the causes of the differences might well be relatively small. So in other words, what you need to have language might be relatively small. The consequences can, of course, be enormous. The consequences, in a sense, lead to massive population densities, overpopulation, climate change, all the things we're having to deal with now. So that there's that that takes place.
And also on a positive note, just all of the wonders of modern civilization.
Absolutely. Let's not.
I was going to say climate change, but I'm glad you took it to the to the positive.
No, it's absolutely right. I mean, one can spend a lot of time thinking of how the development of human society has led to the ecological crisis, and we're living through the pandemic at the moment, and everything is a bit dark. But you're absolutely right. We have music, we have language, we have poetry, we have medicine. We just think, and we neglect so much to think what the rate of infant mortality was even 100 years ago, and look at what it is now. So yes, no, I think you've reminded me rightly that ultimately I'm a human optimist in this.
Yeah, you're definitely in good company here. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I do want to get to a question about the research you've been doing at Turing in a moment, but I think I will go for one more. Well, it just it strikes me as interesting that we see this as somewhat unique. The fact that humans evolved and we're really intelligent and we can do these things that other animals can't do. But then at the same time, there are probably quite a few other animals that have relatively advanced language, whether it's whale species or perhaps other primates and so on. And then going back through the hundreds of millions of years of time, it seems certainly possible that other intelligent species would have arisen and just went extinct for one reason or another, just like a lot of other animals have done so. So the uniqueness in itself is, I would argue, somewhat in question. We just don't know because we can only work with what we've got here and what we happen to find in the fossil record.
Yeah, I think you're pushing your luck a bit if you want to argue that there's kind of lost civilizations, Atlantis in the Cretaceous and so on. But I'll take a kind of slimmed down version of what you're saying and say that clearly intelligence has evolved many times independently. And we know, so you're absolutely right. So, if you go back to the last common ancestor of us and whales, it's not that was a smart creature and then we both developed it. They've independently evolved intelligence, as indeed have the cephalopods. each one is different. And we've got parrots, so each lineage has produced their kind of genius species, the ones that are very, very clever, or groups of species. But I don't think any. None of them have really reached the point where they've taken off. Let us say so that, for example, they are global, or that they have had such an impact on the environment, or that in a way they have created their own environments, and in a sense we're constantly creating our own new ecological niches. And I don't think any lineage has done that. So in that sense, we are kind of uniquely unique, but other species are clearly doing that. Now, if we were to be wiped off the planet, would anything else come along and just evolve the intelligence?
Yeah.
So
you've also got to consider that our technological prowess has only come into fruition in the last, depending on how you're counting, either the last 200 to 500 years or the last 10,000 years. And then, as you mentioned, there were, hundreds of thousands of years before that, when we were meeting up with Neanderthals and possibly breeding with them, and definitely breeding with them.
Definitely breeding.
We're definitely breeding. Well, yes, I suppose so. I think yes. You touch a nerve there with me, because I think that our deep ancestors, the ones hundreds of thousands of years ago, were technologically very proficient. And I mean that does touch on what the work we're doing with the Turing. I mean, certainly the rate of technological change has kind of gone on, and clearly it's kind of ratchet effect that is absolutely the case. But I think technological capacity, potential capabilities, go back really quite deeply into our ancestry, and played a big part in how and why we evolved. I think that would certainly be my view. I mean, going back to your question, of course, it's an interesting point as to whether the fact that we have evolved kind of brought to a stop the evolution of intelligence in other lineages. It's probably too short a time scale to really answer that question properly. But if you take an ecological approach, we have filled the smart niche. So anything else that's going to come along and fill it, and that could be a robot, of course, has to outcompete us in that niche. So and people have argued that in a way, as the more hominins spread around Africa, the tougher it really was for chimps to do very much. For example,
I was going to say we've probably held back the intelligence, the evolution of intelligence in dogs and other animals.
Could you imagine? We just decided because if you think about it, everything that we've learned is that whenever there was someone that was a threat, we eliminated the threat. So if there was any species that was becoming even remotely a threat to us, because we were already there, we went and wiped them. So we just took care of the competition in a very...
Yes, I think it's true. We're not what you probably want to call an ecologically tolerant species.
No.
Ourselves. So, yes. I mean, having said that, of course, some species have done incredibly well out of us. Dogs being one of them.
Yes.
And, of course, cattle and so on. There are far more of them than there ever would have been left to their own devices. So they are, the commensals or the camp followers of humans. There are many species. So many species have suffered, but there are a few that have really looked upon us as the honeypot of life.
Yes, and some who have just got lucky with being well adapted to cities by chance, like pigeons, for instance.
Yeah. Yes, and mosquitoes. Everyone's favourite species.
Although we're going to try and do our best to stop them, but I hope so.
They
anyway.
are outsmarting us. Think about it.
We must
go on, Robert.
No, I was going to say we must be a major selective pressure on other animals, so that you tend to think of that as somehow artificial. But as far as a bird, it's just another form of natural selection, and so the environment's changed, and suddenly there are nice chimney pots you can nest in, and so on. So that for them is a natural process. It doesn't necessarily mean it is. What we're doing intentionally will not appear as intentional in the evolutionary record.
I suppose it depends who's checking out that evolutionary record, millions of years from now.
True, absolutely true.
But that's one for the people or otherwise of the future who are doing that research to worry about rather than us. So let's talk a little bit about the research that you are doing with Turing now, Robert. So what was the motivation behind the Turing projects, and what are the questions in human evolution that you wanted to help with? Also, what are some of the examples of the non-genetic data types which are now the project is beginning to work with? Okay,
I'll come at it slightly tangentially, but should partly go back to your slightly derogatory remarks about the technological capacity of your prehistoric ancestors. So there's I'm going to caricature it, but there's become a sort of orthodox view of human evolution that what really drives it is the social brain. It's language, it's how we speak, it's our ability to interact with each other socially, and in that process, I think one of the things that's happened is we've downgraded the significance of technology. I mean, if you go back 50, 100 years, and I think most anthropologists would have taken the man the toolmaker approach, that we knocked the rocks together and that gave us more food and so on. And I've become very interested in that, partly because of, as I said at the beginning, I have a strong interest in ecology, and I tend to think that resources and access to resources drives evolutionary change. And technology is tremendously important in that. Now, the first evidence we have comes from when some early ancestor, some Australopithecine, probably more than 3 million years ago, started knocking rocks together in such a way as to take off flakes. And what they do with that is a really fundamental change in our ecology, because they're creating sharp cutting edges, and that gives them access to, either they can do woodwork with it, or they can cut up carcasses, or they can hunt. Very simple stuff to begin with, but over the next 2 million years, that becomes more and more important. And that's critical because it actually means that our evolutionary record is unique in that we don't just have a fossil record, we have a record of our behavior through these stone tools. And I think they're fundamental. And so our archaeologists have always, dug up stone tools and measured stone tools and analyzed stone tools in order to infer something about human behavior, what they were eating, what they were cutting with, and of course also the level of thought that has to go into making a stone tool. I don't know if I suggest if you go and find some flint and try and make a stone tool, you'll find it's a lot more difficult than you think. You think you just bang the rocks together, and sadly it doesn't work quite that way. And over the course of our evolution, this has become more and more sophisticated, planning depth involved, and so on. So what I became interested in is there is a vast amount of evidence. There's vast numbers of stone tools. There's vast numbers of publications of it, and I wanted to find a way of trying to bring that together. And analyzing stone tools is interesting, but it's quite a slow process. And I thought, what could we do to automate this to really up the game? And I come back to the genetics, because one of the things that genetics has taught us is large samples, with these multiples of the vast size of the genome. And you can start doing very sophisticated analytical procedures, the whole bioinformatics. And so what I thought was, can we start to, given the size of the archaeological record, can we start to really accumulate big data of this sort? And that really would require a more, the advantages of data science and machine learning. So the project I put into the Alan Turing Institute was to develop such methodologies. And that's what we've been working on for the last 6 months or so, trying to get this up and running. Now, I can tell you more about the details if you're interested.
Well, before thinking about the methods, do the data sets that you would want to use the methods on already exist? And what kind of data would it be? Would it just be like lots of photographs of the stone tools from across the world, or?
Exactly. So there are the stone tools themselves. They're scattered in museums all over the place. There are photographs, but I mean, with digital cameras now, the numbers of photographs have gone up a lot. But historically, when photography was, a roll of 36 films was quite expensive, there weren't necessarily that many. But what archaeologists developed was a very sophisticated process of drawing them. And there are some exquisite line drawings, and you can open any archaeological book of deep prehistory and you'll see these stone tools. So they're drawn in with ink, and there are conventions as to how the direction of striking and things is all shown. So we decided we would start our project. Since what we want to do is hoover up all this pictorial and photographic and indeed real data information, but we thought we'll start with the black and white drawings, partly because there are so many of them, and partly because in a way because they're conventions, it's easier for us to try and get them to extract the necessary information. So what we're doing is either asking colleagues to provide all their black and white drawings, or scanning vast numbers of printed versions. The potential number is enormous, and we're using those to set up training mechanisms for being able to extract the data we want, and up the game, up the level of quantification that we can get, and the speed with which we can get it.
These drawings, presumably they're done in a consistent enough way, and that some kind of machine learning system could learn attributes of the tools based on the drawing. But
exactly.
What is it that you're trying to find out from these drawings?
Okay, so some of it is just getting metrical information. So there's the size and the shape, which we can do with calipers. But obviously, if once this thing becomes an image in a computer, it allows us to take an almost infinite number of measurements, so we can increase that. And size and shape tells us a lot about traditions, particularly different traditions of how who's making it, the function of them. Now,
this is interesting. How are you getting from the 2D drawing to something that can be measured?
You're measuring. Okay, so ultimately we will have to start to try and work with the original things, because they are 3D or 3D scans, and there's a lot of people now scanning in them. But scanning is quite a slow process. So again, we're trying to maximize the amount of data. We're working on 2 dimensions, and we're actually working on 3 dimensions, because most people, when they're doing the drawing, they draw one side, draw the other side, and then they give you a side view and often a top view. So we are working out ways of linking those together. So when you make a stone tool, you start with a core, basically a big lump of rock. You have to find a point on it which has the right angle, and you use a hammer, a stone hammer. Off comes a flake, and then you repeat this until the core is finished. Now that means that each flake that comes off has a ventral side and also a dorsal side. Okay, front and a back. So the front side, the belly side, is the one that was attached to the core, and it's smooth. Obviously, it would be. But the other side is covered in scars, so different planes, different surfaces for all the other flakes that have gone off before it. And the pattern of scarring is indicative of the way the stone tool was produced. So if all the scars are going in the same direction and are all beautifully parallel, you know someone's just gone bang, bang, bang in a row. If, on the other hand, all the scars go round in a kind of circle, you've got a different way of manufacturing. Now, archaeologists worked this out a long time ago, but what we're trying to do is to automate the process and to make it a bit more sophisticated as to how we get that information. And then I can look at it and look at the vast numbers of data and say, well, these guys are doing it this way, and these other people are doing it this other way. This one involves 15 steps, this one involves 3 steps, and make the inferences in that way. So that's the principle we're going for. As I said, for us, this is the first steps. And in an ideal world, we'd have some highly automated process of scanning, 3D scanning thousands of artifacts in and moving them into this system. But at this stage, we are trying to retrieve historically a vast amount of data that is lost in print.
It definitely sounds like a classic machine learning solvable problem in that you've got a lot of unlabeled things that you want to classify into. It's either this type of stone tool or this other type of stone tool. You know how to do it, but you don't want to have to manually do it yourself. And it's impossible to write down any kind of rules-based program where you could say, well, if it has this shape of dent, then it's in this class of tool or another tool. You've got to, get a machine learning algorithm to learn based on the images themselves, because it's too hard to explain. In fact, you can't explain. I would imagine the archaeologists themselves can just, they know it when they see it.
I mean, there's a bit too much of they know it when they see it, because, of course, and it's true, they do. I mean, there are people who can look at a stone tool and tell you everything about it instantly, but it's a verbal record. And, I mean, supposing I want to start linking that rich stone tool record to the rich genetic record. And on the one hand, you've got geneticists who are doing these incredibly sophisticated bioinformatic models. And on the other hand, the archaeologists, the stone tools are saying, well, I think this was made by a left-handed, person using this technique. What we need to do is to have a level of sophistication in our analysis that will allow us to start to really integrate, for example, genetic information and in this case, lithics. I mean, at one stage, of course, I had ambitions to do this with all the fossils as well, and it'd be very nice to do so, but and it will come. So in the end, the impact of data science on paleoanthropology will be enormous, because we'll start having really good quantitative records, and that allows us to build simulation models of what to expect, and then compare that with what we actually see in the record.
Can I ask a quick question, which is lithics just the jargon for stone tools?
Absolutely.
Right,
yes.
Okay, got it.
Sorry, yes, I try to avoid jargon, but I always forget that one. Yeah, lithics is just the lithosphere, the rock world, and so lithics are stone tools. Sounds more scientific.
So what are the different kinds of stone tools which you're looking at? And I guess if these methods prove useful, what kind of questions, perhaps in combination with the genetics, as you mentioned, will you be able to answer that you can't at the moment without having this large-scale classification of stone tools, which is impossible using the human eye?
Yes, I mean, it's a terrible question to ask somebody on a radio podcast, because normally I could pick up some stone tools and say, well, look at this. I mean, in very simple terms, I mean, the earliest technologies are very simple, and literally the oldest one, which is called the Mequium, which is over 3 million years, they would take very large cobbles, lift them up and bring them down on an anvil, and sort of hope a big flake cake comes off. By 2 million years ago, a bit more, 2.5 million years ago, they're doing it rather differently, where they will have a hammerstone in one hand and the core in the other, and then they've got the manipulation to turn the core, angle things, and they're still doing much the same thing, which is taking off flakes, but they're rather smaller and more controlled. producing much better cutting edges, and also leaving behind a core that can become a bit of a chopper itself, so you can use it to chop into carcasses and so on. And then from there, things become more sophisticated. I think they learn to take off big flakes, and then the one you've probably heard of are hand axes, and these are these rather beautiful, often pear-shaped objects where they're now shaping the tools, okay, and shaping them symmetrically, getting them nice and regular. And that's the sort of next stage, and we can count the number of scars, and we can look at the symmetry, and we can measure all these things to pick up that pattern. And then from then on, it becomes a bit of a rush. By a rush, I mean things change over hundreds of thousands of years, and it's speeding up. It gets faster still. Where the critical thing is they lose interest in really big, chunky stone tools, and they want to make lots of small flakes. And they develop techniques, and this is the really cool bit as far as I'm concerned, where they start to shape the core to prepare it so that they can knock off flakes of a regular shape. So this is literally called prepare core technique. And in a way, think about it, because what they're now doing is they're planning ahead of time and preparing it. So it involves a much deeper level of cognitive planning. And that's something that's pretty close to the base of Homo sapiens. It goes back a bit further than that. And after that, it's really a question of just getting more efficient, more sophisticated, getting more regular shapes. They start producing blades, and then in a way that you might think parallels the computer world, it all then becomes very, very small. The microlithics, sort of miniaturization of the process, making lots of little flakes, and then you make composite tools out of it. That is the fastest description of the entire Paleolithic record ever. But that's what you're doing. So what am I trying to tell? I'm trying to tell, for example, with that planning depth, can we measure the degree, the amount of preparation that is going in? If we go back a bit, can we look at, for example, the extent to which there is symmetry in the system? Now, these are all things we can do, but if we could automate it and make it consistent across the globe, rather than having local traditions and local ways of doing it, then I think we'll seriously improve the information potential, the scientific potential of this material.
I guess what I'm imagining is that it's, I don't want to try to oversimplify this, but I'm just to wrap my own head around it, that it's variations on questions about, how was this used, or how was this made, with regard to any particular tool. And I guess from my modern perspective, I would think, well, is this a knife? Is it a hunting spear? Is it something? But I'm sure that the enormous diversity of, considering the stretch of time you're talking about and the whole world, it's going to be a lot more complex than just those categories.
A bit more, but probably not that much more. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the questions are very basic. I mean, on the one hand, what were they used for? And I said earlier on, I think if resources drive evolution, then one of the functions of these stone tools is to acquire resources. And I think this is if you say, what does technology do? And I think I probably include all technology here. It really just does two things. It either gives you access to something you would not otherwise get access to. So a stone tool might give you access to a carcass. You can cut into deep skin and cut the meat out. Or it saves you time. That you could do something you could do otherwise, but it does it much faster. So I mean, we could have this conversation, running backwards and forwards. I don't know if you're in London, but between London and Cambridge, and we could have this conversation. But with technology, we can do it much, much faster, i.e. instantaneously. So that technology does those two things, and probably it is that's driving this pattern. So the function in those terms is important. The second thing then is that technology is, of course, not just a lonely old man sitting in his shed producing tools. It's a social process, and we pass on that information. We can look at the similarities. Why why do two people make the stone tools look the same? Well, it could be because that's the only way to make it, but it could be because they watched their mother or father or brother or something making them, and so it can tell us about cultural processes. And the efficiency of our cultural evolution has evolved over time. So we can infer how culture has become an important process as well. And and then the third thing, which is linked into that, is what it can tell us about cognition. As the brain gets larger, the brain gets larger, but what do we do with it? Can we find ways of quantifying the impact of that? And Dia talked earlier about language and how important is language. So do you need language to make stone tools? Or it could be that once you've got stone tools, language develops because the cognition required for making stone tools, remember the planning, is similar to the sort of things we need to plan conversations. So those are the questions we want to ask. I mean, in a sense, we want it as a sort of general framework for asking major evolutionary questions.
I was going to say that even just having the data makes, even if you don't have a lot of specific questions right now, having the data prepared to be analyzed is already incredibly useful for any questions that show up in the future. Although now I'm a bit fixed on the fact that all of this technology that we use can be reduced to two things. So I'm like, yes, that is true. My phone is either to access things that I don't know or to make it faster.
Yes, it's a simple world, really. And I think that it is that. And again, I come back to genetics. I mean, as I said, genetics came as a shock later in my career, as it were, and I've learned, and I work with geneticists, and I work with genetic data, and so on now, and sort of love it. But the other thing that the geneticists have taught us is firstly the importance of open data. So these genomes are out there. When they publish them now, the genomes are out there, and they can build on each other's knowledge. The trouble with archaeology, it's not necessarily the fault of the archaeologists, is it remains too much of it never gets published, too much of it remains locked in little local things. So we don't have these really big databases. I mean this is selling data to the Turing Institute is not it's probably not a hard sell, but that process of opening up our data and systematizing it means that future generations can come along and do more with it, develop better analytical methods. So that you're absolutely right. That's exactly what underlies it. So I think, and certainly in the framework of the project, we're not going to solve all these problems, but it's a step along the way to that sort of more open science, more global science approach.
Chipping a bit at the problem, right?
Oh, yes, chipping away at the rocks, yes.
Very good, very good. I think just as B was saying earlier, that just having the data out there and the tools available sparks new ideas for questions that could be answered. And I've just had one, which is what could if you presumably if these tools obviously do span a large section of time, and you can see that they get more complicated over time. Can that technology building on technology teach us something about perhaps more generic rules about how innovation in technology occurs, or how humans innovate on previous technology? It's a rough idea, but I'm just putting it out there.
No, I think it is. I think in a way, stone tools are fun. I mean, they're nice to make and they're nice to look at. But that has to be the reason for doing this, is to understand something about processes of innovation, the relationship between cognition, language, technology. These are all questions that are deep in our own society, or even questions of who's making the tools. Who is this something that everybody does and it's a nice egalitarian system, or is there, the napper, who's using it to, acquire status? So those questions are fundamental, and I think we should be doing it. I think the irony is that of course what the bulk of that record, I'd say the bulk of it, I'm talking about the period from over 3 million years down to the last 100,000 years, is probably going to tell us that it was really a very different world. And put it another way around. I told you about these hand axes, these pair drop hand axes. Now, we can argue about it, but optimists would say these things didn't change for about 1.5 million years. I would put it slightly differently. I think they didn't change for the last, they'd go into 2 phases. But even if they didn't change for hundreds of thousands of years, could you imagine any technology where a human society is happy to make the same technology for hundreds of thousands of years, for generation after generation after generation without changing it? And I mean, again, it's an interesting thing to think about technology today, is we either want new things because they improve our lives. We want better vacuum cleaners or better cars because they improve our lives or because they give us status, or we like the challenge of inventing them. And 500,000 years ago, our ancestors didn't look like that at all. So then the question is, at what point does this greater sense of innovation come in? Why? What was stopping it before? What suddenly made it advantageous? What are the costs of high rates of innovation? What you're asking is actually a fundamental question, which, once one steps back from the niceties of stone tools, are exactly the questions we need to ask about technology in general, and use this very long evolutionary record to try and give us different insights than we get if we just go and look at Apple and think that's what technology is all about.
Well, I was going to say maybe we can trace a line all the way from the stone tools to the computer / smartphone, but it is an exponential curve in the technology.
Maybe the
itself.
next smartphones are going to be pear-shaped.
Why not? Yes.
That is actually a very interesting point, which is what caused the change from being so traditionalist and which still exists today. There's a lot of societies where doing as the ancestors have done is the correct way of doing things. And what was it that actually made, the rebellious teenager decide that they want to try make a different tool to make it more efficient? That's actually quite an interesting...
There's so many questions inside that question.
Yes.
Firstly, I think we have to be careful. I mean, what I'm talking about is change, no observable change over hundreds of thousands of years. Even, societies that appear to be relatively technologically stagnant have changed. And I think we wouldn't find any societies today that have complete absence of any technological change. But the rate is very different. And I think it's probably not different. I think it's two things. One is, my answer to everything, of course, is it depends on the ecological conditions, costs and benefits of change and so on. And those clearly shift quite considerably. But I also would think that in any community you look at, you will have individuals who are, your stroppy teenager who wants to change everything, and your very conservative person, this is good enough for my father, is good enough for my grandfather, is going to be good enough for you as well. And in a way, there's always going to be a tension between us. Probably that's quite adaptive, because if the whole world was made up of innovative teenagers, well, nothing would happen for a start, but it's also the case that you need that tension. Because if the whole world was made up of conservative grouches who are not going to change anything, nothing will happen. If the rate of change is too high, then you will not have stable systems. So somehow the tension actually within the society, within individuals, whether that's a small tribal group or whether it's our own communities, is likely to be what will kind of help shape what is a good innovation and what is not a good innovation. Because let's face it, an awful lot of innovations are absolutely terrible things.
And there's already things that have been perfected so long. Like, we're not going to make a better wheel. It has been a wheel exactly as it is we changed the material, but we're not making it more round, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's you can change the efficiency of it, but you can't change the fundamental design of it. And you can. I mean, I don't know enough about it. You're probably much more familiar with modern technologies than I am, but one gets the feeling that some things are just slowing down. One looks at each new Apple phone or Google phone or Android phone, whatever coming out, and the incremental changes, or put it the other way around, the changes become more and more incremental. So it's no longer wow. That's completely different from anything I say. It's got a few more pixels in its camera.
Well, there definitely seem to be times in which, like, a particular innovation sparks a lot of other innovations, and I suppose the innovation of everyone having internet access obviously sparks in the mid-noughties all of this technological innovation on that sense. And now it's being, I think it is continuing, but you're right, it's certainly a more progressive rather than revolutionary at the moment.
Yeah, I think so. And I think there's a book called What's Technology by a man called Arthur, and he makes a distinction, and others have done too, between what are real, genuine innovations, something that changes the game. So your invention of the wheel would be a clear one that's radically different from anything else. I mean, you can't start with something square and say, okay, I'll just change it a bit to get rounder. It is a radically new one. And, I don't know, putting spokes in it or smoothing the bottom, which would be modifications. So, again, I think thinking about how to scale that sort of contrast and thinking about what are the factors that shape when you get these big jumps, and what are the factors that then constrain you to just tinkering around with current technologies, would be a major question, because I think that would help us to understand some of the issues that come out of why technologies can get stuck, for example.
Yes, I think that is a fascinating question for which many people will be pondering, but hopefully having new data and new methods in order to address it. That question of why were certain tools used for almost unchanged for tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of years, and then why were there other periods where things changed so much more rapidly? So it's going to be fascinating to see if there are any big answers that come out of that question anytime soon. But it certainly seems that there might well be. I'm going to start to wrap up now, and this is I'm going to ask you a sort of bonus question I had, which is quite related to what I was just saying, actually. Given, what could be uncovered in the next 10 years based on these methods, what going back like the previous 10 years, what has been the most surprising result to come out of the study of human evolution that you really hadn't thought would happen, but because of new technology was uncovered?
Besides genetics being relevant, yes.
I suppose, we have got into that already.
I mean, I think so. Okay, I'll give you. I mean, the genetics is the obvious answer. I mean, it's 10. It's the last 10 or 10 years or so. The whole admixture game has been revolutionary.
Well, what's meant by admixture?
In other words, the evidence of interbreeding between Neanderthals and modern humans.
Right.
And so
Okay.
on. So, but if you're not going to let me to talk about that, I'll give you another one, which is because it's a good interesting question. How much of our science develops because somebody's got a new machine that goes ping louder than anybody else's. And the other one, of course, is scanning technology. So if you think, we've had 150 years or so of digging up bones and fossils and measuring them and observing them. But in the last 10 or 15, even longer than that, but the real impact's been in the last 10 or 15 years, where you can use CT scans, you can use MRIs, you can use micro CTs, all these techniques that are available, so we can actually look inside the fossils and see structures and see details of morphology, which were completely unobservable before. So you learn, it's possible to learn. There's a group in Kent that did fabulous work on looking at the enamel dentine junction in teeth and finding that when you look at them in detail, they have a phylogenetic signal. In other words, they kind of have a little label saying, I belong to this species, which we would never have got. And then, the work of one of my colleagues here in Cambridge is looking, for example, using scanning to actually begin to see the relationship between all the little things that go on in the inner surface of the skull and how that relates to the brain size and the convolutions of brains. None of that would have been possible without this improvement in scanning, 3D scanning technology. So I'd say that would be my other example, if you're not going to let me talk about genetics, that's had a really big impact.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I guess like you said, it's interesting to think. Well, does the technology that we talk about as being really big and exciting and new and shiny precipitate new discoveries? But certainly, with the example of genetics, it does seem to be that we've learned a hell of a lot about the different patterns in migration and so on, and mixture, and then the other example you've given on scanning technology as well.
I think genetics changed all life, almost for almost all.
You mean our
sciences.
understanding of the relatedness of all life? Is that what you mean?
Yes. Yeah, I think genetics is important. However, let me just have a quick fight back.
Go ahead.
None of this is possible without people going out and doing field work and finding fossils.
Yes.
Okay, there are technologies now that are better for doing that. We can use GPSs to find where we are, and there's LiDAR and so on. But without fossils, none of this is possible. So, people who walk the landscapes in Africa or wherever, or dig up caves, still there would be no ancient DNA without people doing that. So no matter how good the genetics becomes or the scanning technology, the core of the subject remains finding new things. And the papers, every time we find something new, everyone gets terribly excited.
Well, that's a fantastic note to end on. I think, the reality is that even if you're a data scientist, you can still go and do field work, and that matters.
Yes, exactly.
Basically, get out of the house.
It's good for you too, absolutely. And it's exciting and fun.
Absolutely. Robert, before we let you go, where can people find out more about this work or your work in general? Do you have a website or social media people can follow?
I'm afraid I'm not a social media person, so I don't have. But there's a website on the Turing Institute, Palaeoanalytics, which also has links to my other university website and things like academia.edu, which will have all the publications and the projects. So that's the best access. So it's called the project's called Palaeoanalytics, and you find it on the Turing website. Yeah. It's
a word that in doing the research for this episode, I had to be very careful to spell correctly. Palaeoanalytics. All right. Robert, thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
That's a pleasure.
If you have an interesting topic you'd like featured on the show, a guest recommendation or a burning question, email podcast@turing.ac.uk.
The Turing podcast is hosted by Ed Cowstry, B. Costa Gomez and Joe Dungate, and produced by Dan Whitfield for the Alan Turing Institute.
Music for the podcast was provided by Jam and Sun. You can check out his latest releases at jamandsun.bandcamp.com.